The voicemail said I got the job. That shouldn't have been possible. I'd spilled coffee across the blueprints 20 minutes into the interview, mispronounced the owner's last name twice, and answered a question about hull restoration with an example from a boat I'd actually damaged, not repaired. By the time I left the boatyard office, I was already composing the version of this story I'd tell my brother, the one where I laughed it off and started applying somewhere else. Instead, 3 days later, a voice I didn't recognize told me Windward Boatworks wanted me to start Monday. Not the runner-up. Not a backup option. Me, specifically, by name, as if there had never been anyone else on the list. I'm Caleb Ashford. I was 29 that spring, a freelance shipwright who patched together a living restoring old wooden sailboats for people with more nostalgia than money. I'd worked out of a rented shed in Bellingham for 2 years, taking whatever came through the door, and I was good at my job in the quiet, unglamorous way that never shows up on anyone's radar. So when a boatyard on San Juan Island flew me out for an interview I was certain I'd failed, I told myself it was a fluke in their hiring software. I did not expect to spend the next 6 months trying to figure out why Josephine Calloway had wanted me there before she'd ever seen my work. The ferry ride to Friday Harbor took 40 minutes, gray water sliding past under a sky the color of wet slate. I stood at the rail with my duffel bag and watched the island rise out of the fog, all pine and weathered docks, and told myself this was temporary. 6 months, maybe less. Restore 1 boat, collect a paycheck, go home with a better resume. Windward Boatworks sat at the end of a gravel road, a long low building with green paint peeling off in strips and a covered slip where a single sailboat rested on blocks, stripped down to bare ribs. Even in that condition, I could tell she'd been beautiful once. Classic lines, a low sweeping bow, the kind of craftsmanship nobody bothered with anymore because it took too long and cost too much. A woman came out of the office before I'd finished parking my rental car. Dark hair pulled back hard enough to look like a decision rather than a style, a canvas jacket 2 sizes too practical for someone who clearly ran the place. She didn't smile. She looked at me the way you'd look at a delivery you weren't sure you'd ordered. "You're late," she said. The ferry was on time. I wasn't sure which dock. "There's one dock." She turned without offering a hand. "I'm Josephine Calloway. People call me Joe." "Don't." I followed her toward the stripped-down hull, already regretting several life choices. "Is that the boat?" "That's the boat." She stopped beside it and put one hand flat against the wood, the gesture so unconsciously tender it didn't match anything else about her posture. "The Wanderer. She's been in my family 60 years. I need her seaworthy by August." That's an aggressive timeline for a hull this far gone. "I'm aware of the timeline, Mr. Ashford." "Caleb's fine." "I'm aware of the timeline, Caleb." She said my name like she was testing whether it fit. Something crossed her face when she did, quick and unreadable, gone before I could name it. "You'll have full access to the shop and my father's old tool collection. I expect updates every Friday. I don't expect small talk." "Understood." She studied me a moment longer than the conversation required. "Why did you take this job?" The question threw me. "You called me. I assumed you wanted the work done." "I did." She looked back at the hull. "I'm only surprised you came all this way for a boatyard you'd never heard of. You offered more than anyone else did." "That's not why I asked." She walked off toward the office before I could respond, leaving me standing beside a half-dismantled sailboat with the distinct sense that I'd failed some test I hadn't known I was taking. That became the pattern of my first weeks on the island. Joe ran the yard like a woman, keeping several plates spinning that nobody else could see, sharp with the crew, careful with the accounts, and unnervingly specific about the Wanderer. She wanted the original mast wood matched exactly, not approximated. She wanted the brass fittings restored, not replaced, even when replacement would have been cheaper and faster. Every choice she made about that boat carried weight I couldn't account for, and every time I asked why, she gave me an answer that explained nothing. "It matters to my father," she said once, though I later learned her father had died the year before I arrived. I let it go, mostly because the work itself pulled me in. There's a rhythm to restoring something that's been neglected. You find the damage, you understand why it happened, and you rebuild it stronger without erasing what made it worth saving in the first place. I'd always thought that was the whole appeal of the job. On San Juan Island, sanding down 60-year-old cedar planks while gulls screamed over the harbor, I started to think the appeal ran deeper than that. I started to think I liked watching Jo Calloway loosen, inch by inch, the longer she stood near that boat. She brought coffee to the shop most mornings, always 2 cups, always pretending the second one was an accident. She corrected my splicing technique with a precision that told me she'd learned boat building from someone who cared enormously about getting it right. She laughed exactly once in my first month, at something I said about the outboard motor sounding like a dying accordion, and then looked startled at herself, like laughing wasn't part of the job description she'd written. The mystery of why she'd hired me sat between us the whole time, unspoken and impossible to ignore. It was her mother who finally broke it open. Margaret Calloway showed up at the yard on a Thursday in May, a small sharp-eyed woman with Joe's same guarded posture and none of Joe's restraint. She found me alone in the shop, Joe having driven into town for hardware, and she stood in the doorway studying me with an intensity that made me put down my sander. "You're the Ashford boy," she said. "I'm sorry." "Caleb Ashford. Walter's grandson." She said it like a fact she'd been waiting a long time to confirm out loud. "You have his hands. He held a chisel exactly like that." "You knew my grandfather?" Margaret walked further into the shop, running one finger along the exposed ribs of the Wanderer the same way her daughter did. "Walter Ashford built this boat 60 years ago, for my husband's father, before either of us were born, but I knew Walter later. Better than I should have." The floor seemed to shift slightly under me. "My grandfather built the Wanderer. He built half the boats that ever left this island." She smiled, small and sad. "He also wrote me letters for 2 years before I married Thomas Calloway. I still have them. I never told my daughter that until she found one, tucked behind a panel in this hull, during the restoration. I stared at her, pieces sliding into place faster than I could hold them. That's why she hired me. Because of my last name. She hired you because she wanted to know if the stories were true. Whether an Ashford could really build something worth keeping a person's whole life. Whether love like that was real, or whether Walter simply wrote well." Margaret's eyes softened. "I think she's found her answer somewhere in the last month, though she hasn't said so out loud. I didn't know what to do with that information. I still don't, entirely, except that it explained every strange instruction Joe had given me since I'd arrived, every insistence on matching wood grain nobody else would have noticed was wrong, every silence when I asked why any of it mattered so much. It wasn't about the boat. It had never only been about the boat. When Joe came back that evening and found her mother's car still in the lot, her expression shifted through several stages of alarm before settling on something close to resignation. "She told you," Joe said. "It wasn't a question. About the letters. About my grandfather." Joe set down the hardware bag and leaned against the workbench, arms crossed, and for the first time since I'd met her, She looked less like a boatyard owner and more like a woman who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time without setting it down. I found the first one 8 months ago. Behind the panel by the mast step, where nobody would have looked unless they were pulling the whole boat apart. I read it twice before I understood what it was. And you hired an Ashford to finish the job your family's Ashford started. I hired the best restoration shipwright I could find who happened to share a last name I couldn't stop thinking about. A faint, unwilling smile crossed her mouth. You were also, unfortunately, very good at your job. That part wasn't planned. You could have just told me. And say what? My mother almost married your grandfather and I've spent 8 months wondering if that means something. She shook her head. It sounded insane out loud. It still does. It doesn't, I said, and meant it more than I expected to. It sounds like you wanted to know if some things are worth waiting for. Joe looked at me for a long moment, the shop quiet except for water lapping against the dock outside. Do you think they are? I crossed the space between us before I'd decided to. I think I've spent a month trying not to answer that question every time you hand me a cup of coffee you pretend is an accident. Her breath caught. It's never been an accident. I know. She reached up and touched the collar of my shirt, straightening something that didn't need straightening, and I understood exactly what my grandfather must have felt 60 years earlier, standing in this same yard with a Callaway close enough to lose himself in. I kissed her before either of us could talk ourselves out of it, and she kissed me back like she'd been waiting through every professional silence and every Friday update to finally stop pretending. This is a spectacular violation of my own hiring policy, she murmured against my mouth. You wrote the policy. You're allowed to break it. I really am not. She broke it anyway. Over the following weeks, the island wrapped itself around us in ways I hadn't expected. We watched orcas surface off the western shore on a Sunday when the yard was closed. We drove out to the lavender farm because Joe swore the owner made the only coffee cake worth the calories, and she was right. We climbed the old lighthouse at the North Point and she told me about her father, about learning to sand a hull before she could write in cursive, about inheriting a business that scared her more than she'd ever admit to her mother. I told her about my grandfather, the letters I hadn't known existed until a woman I was falling for handed them to me on her porch one evening, worn paper covered in handwriting so similar to mine it unsettled us both. He loved her enough to write 2 years of letters, Joe said, reading one of them by lamplight, and he never sent the last one. Why not? He must have known she was going to marry Thomas. I think he decided some things aren't meant to be forced. She looked up at me. I used to think that was tragic. Now I think it's the reason I noticed you the second you walked into my boatyard. That should have been the ending. It wasn't. The trouble arrived in July, 3 weeks before the Wanderer was due back in the water, in the form of a certified letter from a Seattle development firm. Joe didn't mention it for 2 days, and when I finally found the envelope on her desk and asked, her face closed in a way I hadn't seen since my first morning on the island. My father left more debt than anyone realized, she said finally. The yard's barely broken even in 3 years. A developer wants the waterfront lot for condominiums. They've offered enough to clear everything and leave me comfortable. You're considering it. I'm considering not losing everything my father built by refusing to be practical. Her voice cracked on the last word. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to talk me out of it before I'd made peace with it myself. You didn't want me to talk you out of it, or you didn't want me to have an opinion at all. Caleb. I've spent 2 months rebuilding a boat that means more to your family than either of us fully understood, and you were going to sell the yard out from under it without telling me until the papers were signed. The hurt surprised me with how much it cost to say out loud. I'm not just the guy you hired to finish a job, Joe. Not anymore. You don't get to decide that alone. She flinched like I'd struck something true. I've run this place by myself for a year. I don't know how to ask for help without it feeling like failure. Then let it feel like failure for one night, and let me help anyway. She didn't answer right away. She walked to the window and looked out at the Wanderer, nearly finished now, brass fittings gleaming under work lights, 60 years of two families' history sitting on blocks in her own boatyard. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. If I sell, this boat becomes someone's dock ornament. Everything Walter and my father built becomes a parking garage. Then don't sell. I moved to stand beside her. Let me buy in. I've got savings, not enough to fix everything, but enough to matter. We finished the restoration, we open the yard up for charters and small commissions, we make this place work instead of just survive. You'd risk your own money on a business that's barely breaking even? I'd risk it on you, I said, and watched something in her finally give way, the guardedness she'd worn like armor since the day I'd met her cracking into something closer to hope. We spent the next week going over numbers instead of letters, and it turned out to be its own kind of romance, the two of us hunched over a kitchen table arguing about margins and slip fees until midnight. Margaret contributed her own savings without being asked, saying only that she owed Walter Ashford a debt she'd never gotten to repay, and this was close enough. The developer's offer expired unanswered. Windward Boatworks stayed exactly where it was, gravel road and peeling paint and all. The Wanderer went back into the water on the second Saturday of August, exactly on schedule, brass polished and hull gleaming under a sun that finally decided to show up for the occasion. Half the island turned out to watch her christened. Jo stood at the bow in a borrowed blue dress, her hand resting on what my grandfather had shaped 60 years before either of us was born, and when she looked back at me, there wasn't a trace of the guarded woman who told me not to call her Jo on my first day. Walter never got to see this boat sail again, she said. I think he'd have liked knowing his grandson brought her home. I think he'd have liked knowing his grandson didn't wait 60 years to say something true. She laughed, bright and unguarded, the sound I'd been chasing since that first accidental cup of coffee. Neither of us waited very long, all things considered. Long enough to nearly lose the boatyard. Long enough to be sure. She took my hand. Ask me the question you've been avoiding all week, Caleb Ashford. I didn't need to ask twice. A year later, on the same dock where I'd first watched her walk toward me without a smile, I asked Josephine Calloway to marry me, and she said yes before I'd finished the sentence, laughing through tears the same way her mother had once described crying over letters an Ashford never sent. We married the following spring aboard the Wanderer, sails full, the whole island crowded onto the dock to watch two families finally finish what they'd started 6 decades earlier. Margaret stood at the front holding a stack of letters she'd finally decided to frame instead of hide, and when Jo walked toward me across that worn wooden deck, I understood every unexplained instruction she'd ever given me about matching the grain exactly, about never replacing what could be repaired instead. She hadn't only been restoring a boat. She'd been finishing a story her mother never got to end, and somehow, without either of us planning it, she'd let me help her write the last page. Windward Boatworks still sits at the end of that gravel road, though the sign reads Ashford Calloway now, and the Wanderer still goes out most weekends with Jo at the helm and me trimming sails I once rebuilt plank by plank. Some evenings she catches me staring at the mast step where her mother's letters were hidden for 60 years, and she doesn't ask what I'm thinking. She already knows. She just takes my hand and steers us back toward the harbor, toward the life neither of our grandparents ever got to have, and lets the water do the rest. If you were the one hired for a job no one would explain, and the truth turned out to be a love story older than you were, would you have stayed to finish it? Drop your first name, your age, and the city or country you're watching from in the comments. I read every single one. And if stories like this one feel like home to you, we've opened up memberships for shorter, exclusive tales every week with 0 ads. Like this video, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.